Like to introduce our speaker for today. Okay, so earlier this year we had a cancellation in our normal speaker schedule, and it left us with a hole. And we don't normally invite graduate students to give a talk outside of our department. As you know, we have frequently have opportunities for graduate students to present their research. And I heartily encourage everybody to take advantage of that opportunity. But today's speaker, Noah Robinson, I think is an unusual graduate student. And I think it'll be very interesting to see what he has to say today. Let me tell you what I know about Noah. I met him at Vanderbilt University when I was visiting a colleague. And Noah is doing some groundbreaking research using virtual reality to treat, I don't like using the word disorders, but affective conditions. Let me tell you what I know about Noah. He did his undergraduate degree at the University of Maryland, and he published his thesis as a first author. It was on attachment and crying in psychotherapy. And in chatting with that, I think it's a very interesting piece of research. And then after that, he went and did 2 years at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And that's where he was first exposed to virtual reality. After that, he went to Vanderbilt University, where he is currently doing his PhD. He has essentially started up his own company called Very Real Health. He's the founder and CEO of this company. He has received grants from the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Drug and Addiction, NIDA. Okay. And he's a very impressive guy. I also would encourage the graduate students, we're having a wine and cheese afterwards, right? I hope that you'll talk with him about the wine and cheese. I think he's got a very interesting and compelling personal story. He's also going to give the Coggy talk tomorrow, in which he's going to, he's brought his virtual reality headsets that he's hoping to let people use them for demonstration purposes. So I think it's a real treat to have Noah here, and I think we're going to learn some very interesting stuff. Could you please help me welcome him?
All right, can you guys, is the mic, you guys hear me? Cool. Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Yeah, this is kind of a last minute talk a couple of weeks ago, but I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time in Canada as well, so loving it so far. So, but yeah, today I'm going to talk to you guys about how I'm using virtual reality with addiction research, but I also think it broadly applies to other types of research related to psychopathology, which is debatable. But you know, just generally when people are having mood dysregulation and things like that, how can we use virtual reality to help them? So I guess we don't really need to go over my background because you just did that. But yeah, this is my background, and I got exposed to VR at NIH, and kind of the first time I tried it. How many of you have tried virtual reality before? Okay, wow. So that's a lot of you guys. And the first time I tried it, when I was transported to another environment, I was like, this is going to change. I think this is going to change psychology. What really got me excited was when I bought a headset and was at home and put on the virtual reality and was able to talk to other people in real time. And the social aspect of being alone in my room, but then putting on the headset and being with other people was what really got me excited about how it could be used in clinical psychology. And so my research interest broadly is exploring how social networks in virtual reality, so you go in, you talk to other people who are represented by avatars, can be used as a telehealth intervention to treat various types of mental health disorders. And my initial focus is on addiction and substance use. And one thing to mention, because I'm very interested in peer-based telehealth interventions, like lay counselors and things like that. And also when we talk about technology and its potential to augment or help therapy with in-person therapists, I think a key point to make is that if every therapist in the United States worked for 50 hours per week only seeing patients, so seeing 50 patients per week, they'd be able to reach 12% of the population that needs treatment and intervention, And I'm assuming that's similar here in Canada with the number of people who need treatment versus the number of people who are trained to administer it. So I think technology can be a really, especially group-based interventions, can be a really effective way to scale and allow us to reach a lot more people. The reason I'm focused on addiction is that it's a huge crisis in the United States. I know it's also a worldwide crisis, but 72,000 people died in 2018, and also there's additionally 23 million people dependent on substances. And then there's also billions of dollars of cost in terms of the missed work days and all the kind of total cost of addiction. And generally, only 2.6 million people seek treatment in the US for substance use disorder. And I think one of the most interesting things is that nearly half of them seek treatment through self-help. So they're going to Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, those kinds of peer groups, and they're not even interacting with the healthcare system, even though most of our research is around the healthcare system and how we can improve it and things like that. So we're not even reaching, even though it's only about 10% of people with substance use disorders, half of the people who seek treatment are not even interacting with the systems that we really focus on. In addition to that, the healthcare system is not very effective at treating addiction. 85% of patients will relapse within a year. And I'm really interested in this period of early abstinence. So someone goes to treatment or they're trying to stop themselves. And oftentimes what leads to the relapse is strong negative affect or strong negative emotion. Distress, anhedonia, kind of people are feeling like they're having negative experiences essentially, and they use substances to self-regulate. And that's where I think virtual reality can be particularly effective. A lot of people assume that exposure therapy is, they think about VR and psychology and they think exposure therapy, that's kind of the best way we can recreate stimuli to which people are phobic or have drug-related cues and have people overcome their reactions to the cues. But I really think there's a huge amount of potential beyond that in terms of how we can use VR to help people. And I'm really focused on cognitive behavioral therapy. My mentor, Steve Holland, is really big into CBT, and I just wanted to explain it, kind of background and where I think VR fits in. So generally the model of CBT is that you have your environment, and within our environment we have thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and physiology, and all of them are connected. So if you're having negative thoughts, that can affect your mood, your behaviors, and your physiology. And in therapy, what we teach patients is that you can't just decide not to feel anxious or depressed or kind of, we don't really have control over our affect. But what we do have control over is that we can examine our beliefs, so we can see if we're having distorted cognitions and things like that and help people challenge those. We can try new behaviors, or you can use medications or other physiological interventions like meditation to adjust your physiology or exercise and things like that. And what we see with drug addiction is oftentimes people are adjusting their physiology to either suppress negative emotion or change their behaviors. And, get at their negative affect. And what we see for virtual reality is that you can immerse people in a new environment, and essentially you're able to change the context of the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and therefore potentially get at the negative affect. Just gonna use my source bar here. Okay. So what is virtual reality? So a lot of you guys who said you've tried virtual reality, how many of you have tried virtual reality and you had 2 hand controllers so you could like walk around the room and things like that? Okay, interesting. So about half of the people who have tried VR have tried kind of the more immersive sense. And that's really what I'm talking about here. So I'm not talking about Google Cardboard or things where you're sitting, you're stationary in one position. This is really immersive. You're picking up objects, you're painting, you're playing Beat Saber, and you're active and moving and things like that. So it really has a lot of effects in terms of the physiology. You're really engaged in behaviors and things like that. So you're not just consuming technology, but you're actually in the environment interacting. And interestingly, with virtual reality, a key concept, 2 key concepts in VR are immersion and presence. So presence is the extent to which a person thinks, feels, and behaves as if the virtual environment is real. So reaction time to stimuli, interactions with other people socially, all those different kinds of things are related to immersion and presence. And interestingly, the cognitive behavioral literature has been disparate from the VR literature, but the definition of presence maps on perfectly to the cognitive behavioral model, where you're changing the environment, you're putting someone in a virtual environment, and you're changing their underlying thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And just quickly, I just wanted to kind of focus on the broad uses of VR thus far. And really, again, the main focus is on negative affect. So exposing people and really inducing a negative mood state and helping them overcome their reaction to stimuli so that they can overcome their phobias and things like that. But there are also some research with positive affect. However, all of these involve, again, changing the environment so that you can target something in the cognitive behavioral model to help them overcome their psychopathology. And so with exposure, we have PTSD, so you can bring people back to a virtual Iraq or Afghanistan for war-related PTSD, and in 1 or 2 sessions, you can actually treat their full PTSD. Phobias, so recreating stimuli to which someone is phobic, like spiders or dogs, and having them overcome that affective reaction. And then relapse prevention. So this is exposure response prevention for addiction, where you have someone go into a virtual bar, or actually NIDA funded for building a virtual crack house, which I think people are sort of surprised to know that the funding agency funded that, but then you can have people practice their refusal skills in that context. On the so that's mostly the negative aspect side, really exposure therapy. On the positive side, there's distraction, so pain reduction, so VR is being explored as an alternative to using opioids for pain treatment. Procedural anxiety, so people who are, especially children who are very anxious about going in and getting operations. There's some programs that even has a virtual, someone who's gone through the operation, you put on the headset and they tell you their story of what it was like, and they show you the operating room and kind of desensitize the person to that experience. And then other areas are mindfulness, so having people meditate in VR. Psychoeducation, so a huge area of training in terms of helping people to learn how to practice their skills and things. And then I'm interested in other positive hedonic experiences. So how else can we help people with virtual reality? And where I think specifically the VR can come into play is that right now for addiction, in general, cognitive therapy, like that model where we said examine beliefs, change your behaviors, adjust your physiology, when we're doing talk therapy with patients, we're really mostly having them, we're trying to train them to think about the consequences of using. Using is a behavior in relapse. It's like an automatic behavior, texting your drug dealer and getting you drugs. And we're trying to teach people to override that automatic behavior through cognitions and thinking about the consequences, why you want to stay sober, all that kind of stuff. The problem is that, and so behavior therapy, in general, you want to replace the problematic behavior, so have people engage in other activities and things like that. But the problem is that behaviors often override cognition. They're more powerful in terms of their associations with cues and things like that. And where we think VR can come into play is that it can be a just-in-time cognitive intervention. So at the moment that someone wants to text their dealer or use drugs, instead they have an alternative behavior to put it on the headset and become immersed in this other world. And once they're in the other world, they can then focus on the cognitions that are triggering that behavior. And we think that that could potentially be an effective type of intervention. And so how we started this process is that during my first year of grad school, I started working at an inpatient 30-day rehab facility. And so this is where people are coming to live for rehab for substances. It's in Tennessee, so it's a rural area, and most of them, I would say about 60% are related to opioids, about 20% meth, and then a lot of people with alcohol or polysubstance. A lot of people who are using one substance are actually using several others. And my first patient, I started out on intakes, and I had a supervising therapist with me and everything. And my first patient was a 27-year-old female, and she had been using injection heroin, and her parents had been using heroin. And they were forcing her to do prostitution to get money so that they could all use drugs and buy them. And she attempted suicide and survived, and this was her second day after surviving, and she was in detox. So she was 2 days detoxing from heroin. She was depressed, she was anxious, and we went through the intake interview, and she was crying and things like that. It was very intense. And I later this was my first patient, but I later came to find out, these stories are happening all the time. I mean, it's very, very, I haven't had a single patient. I thought I would have at least some patients who were just using drugs for partying and got into substance use. I haven't had a single patient who didn't have severe underlying issues that they were self-medicating with addiction or with their substance. And so at the end of our intake interview, I asked her, do you want to try virtual reality? I had brought it down. At that time, it was the HTC Vive, so you have to set up these little things in the corners, and it's connected to a big computer. And she said, sure. But she had been crying, and she was kind of tentative. I said, you can take off the headset at any time. And I put her in VR, and I was just going to show her a couple different apps, just some games and things like that. But when I put her in, there's this home environment on Steam VR. That's kind of this cabin in the mountains. And she puts on the headset, and before I can launch an app, she immediately starts smiling. She's like, wow, this is so amazing. I've never been hiking before, but look at the mountains. They're so beautiful, and all that kind of stuff. And she basically, after she went into that, I mean, the therapist and I were really surprised because you don't normally see such a strong affective change in a patient when they've just been crying and telling you about trauma, and then they're all of a sudden smiling and laughing. And so basically, I put her in some games. So there's like a shooting game, there's painting, like you guys saw earlier, there's rhythm games and things like that. Ping pong, archery, kind of some shooting games, things like that. And so I just put her in some pre-existing games. And after about 30 minutes, she took off the headset and she had this bewildered look on her face and she said, all of my anxiety is gone. And the therapist and I looked at each other kind of in shock because we just didn't expect that. And I started doing this with one more patients, and at one point the nurses in the detox unit asked me, like, what are you doing to these patients? Because they're leaving and they're really down and kind of withdrawn, and they're coming back and they're smiling and laughing, and it seems like this huge change in mood. And so we wanted to quantify this change and kind of see, okay, we're observing this, but what's actually happening? So we designed a study, and the hypothesis was that VR would increase positive and decrease negative affect. And so this study was with 241 patients. It was a single-arm trial, so this was really just exploratory to see the patients seem like they're changing in their mood. Is their mood actually changing? And not necessarily teasing apart what exactly the effect, what was causing the exact effects. And so they could play games for 30 minutes, but actually they were enjoying it so much that they wanted longer, and so we extended it to 60 minutes because the patients were enjoying it and it seemed to be an effective intervention, so we allowed them to do that. And they filled out this questionnaire before and after their first VR session. So this is positive, negative, affective schedule, and it's 10 positive emotions and 10 negative emotions that can be composite to the positive mood and negative mood. And so this is the change that we observed in positive mood and negative mood. So interestingly, I think it's interesting that the first medium effect sizes, but the positive mood has a larger effect size than negative mood decrease. And we know generally that medications for different types of, really all types of medications that affect mood, we're able to decrease negative mood, but generally we're not able to induce positive mood. And so that's a really powerful thing that we're seeing with the virtual reality, that you could actually create that positive hedonic experience and not just decrease their negative mood. And if you break out every individual emotion, every positive emotion increased significantly and every negative emotion decreased significantly, except for hostility, which has kind of a floor effect, and I think that means that one of my 10 research assistants were not pissing off the patients, so that was a good sign. But yeah, they weren't very hostile to begin with. But so we kind of saw these effects. We saw that VR potentially is increasing positive mood and decreasing negative, although again, this was a single arm trial, so we don't necessarily know that that's exactly what was causing it. And we wanted to ask patients about their experiences. So we want to say, okay, what's actually happening in your brain, and or what's your kind of self-reported experience of these changes in mood? And so we just asked them 10 standardized questions about their experience, and just asking what they like, what they not like, things like that. First thing we asked them is that how long they thought the effects lasted. And most patients said over multiple hours, so that was kind of interesting. And then the second most common response was actually unclear duration, which is interesting because this population generally has deficits in self-monitoring mood as well, so that kind of fits. But it seems like it wasn't just the experience of VR, there was some kind of hangover effect. But we really wanted to ask patients what was their experience, and so I have two anecdotes of patients and kind of describing what their experiences were. So the first is Margaret. She's 28 years old, female, and she's using opioids and cannabis, and she had a major depressive disorder, anxiety, and personality disorder. And she said, being able to paint for a little and be as free and open as I wanted is satisfying. We get caught up in our heads a lot, and it's hard to get out of them. VR was true freedom. Expressing myself fully without any judgments coming even from myself. Just literally feeling and being in that moment allows me to just have fun and enjoy doing something other than being in reality. It's like a mental vacation, but a really cool vacation. And this was something that we heard from a lot of patients, that the VR was kind of this psychological reset, psychological blanket, mental vacation, that is a really powerful thing for them to kind of get away from everything. And then there's John, who was 22 years old, male. He was using alcohol, stimulants, benzodiazepines, and cannabis, so example, polysubstance, pretty common. He had a history of childhood sexual abuse, neglect, and he was homeless before he came in. And he said, trick my brain and made me believe I was in another world. I had to focus and see something else instead of my current situation in life. On the walk back up after doing VR, I felt good. I was in some sort of state of bliss. I felt more positive and comfortable. My anger and anxieties went down. Then you come back to the house and somebody's complaining about something stupid. It's like, dude, what is there to complain about? And so we see, and we saw this in a lot of patients, where you see this decreased reactivity to negative events in real life after they come out of the VR and have that positive experience in virtual reality. And so this was consistent, so these are some other kind of quotes from patients, but escaping their mind. One person with PTSD talked about how he didn't have to think about the nightmares and things like that. So really facilitating this escapism. And also patients seemed, after they went in, just broadly, another one last thing is that patients who are at risk of leaving against therapeutic advice, like they were really overwhelmed and stuff, they actually, after they went into VR, a lot of those patients stayed in treatment instead of leaving. So that's kind of another interesting thing, where they get that kind of relief from their negative mood. However, a key thing is that I was just standing there while the patients were escaping into virtual reality, and the goal of a treatment program is not just to have people escaping, but you want them to actually confront their underlying symptomatology and learn strategies to overcome that. And so that's where the social VR comes in, because I can put on a headset and the patient has a headset, and then we're able to go in together and I'm able to interact with them and do therapy with them. And so how I got into social VR was, since 2014, I've been part of VR Chat, which is an online VR community. It started out with just 14 of us would meet once a week and then get into a circle and introduce ourselves, and now there's like 4 million accounts that have been created, and it's a pretty big app. And I run a show in social VR where we talk about technology and psychology and things like that. It's all VR, virtual, so I'm kind of standing there with my avatar. That's me, it's like a 3D scan. And then everyone you see here is alone in their room in real life, but they're all able to talk. They have a microphone. You have 2 hand controllers, so you're gesturing, so any gestures you see will be like them actually doing that. And I started, and I'm just going to play this just a couple minutes, but I just want you guys to hear their experiences and why. This is kind of what got me into thinking that the social part could be particularly effective. So let's see. So work.
Okay.
It was on Valentine's Day too, so.
For private reasons, I started hanging out, or I stopped hanging out with my real life friends a couple of years back, less and less. I never thought I would end up making so many friends that I did in VR chat. And what I think is different, it's the people that I see are not as abstracted, like on a forum or when I'm playing games with other people.
For me, it's like I have literally no social life outside of the arches because I have a really high social anxiety and I can't really go outside. I faint in public and stuff like that. And since I got my Oculus, I slowly opened up in public a little bit more. So I was not able to go to the store and buy food and stuff so easily. And now it's getting easier. It's still really, really hard for me, but it's getting easier, and it really helps to communicate with other people. Hopefully, in the near future, I'm able to socialize outside of the arches like I do in the arches. Yeah.
For 10 years, I was off and on looking at transitioning because I had been kind of halfway accepting it, but halfway denying it. But then I decided I'm just going to tell them in VR because I was already joking around, or seemingly joking around, putting on a girl avatar. Once I was able to come out to them and as accepting as they were, I actually felt motivated to really, really make this real for myself. And the experience that I had in VR, I would not have been now I'm going to a gender therapist. And I know people can think okay, how can the avatar really do that much, right? How can it mean so much just using some 3D model you download and stuff? This really does do something, especially looking in the mirror, and once you come to connect with it, it really did bring that connection that I would never have tried because I was denying myself so much. I was like, no, you can't put makeup on, you can't put on a dress, you can't do any of this. But then it's instantly I put something on, I look in the mirror, and it might not be so realistic, but it was enough that I was like, okay, this feels right.
Yeah, so those are just a few examples, but there's lots of them. I mean, there's a 20-minute video of people talking and about their experiences, and so you see that it's not just escapism. People are escaping into another reality where they can explore their identity, they can try being other people, and they have a huge amount of social support, and they can explore these things. And so, but what's interesting is that there's a lot of kind of remission of some psychopathology when people are in VR chat, and that's not even a structured environment to treat anything. That's just the nature of the technology and socialization in the virtual environment is facilitating some of these things. And so that's kind of what we're focused on, is trying to create a structured environment intervention where you can actually treat these underlying issues. And that's where, yeah, so we're calling this cognitive behavioral immersion. So it's not necessarily therapy, but by immersing someone in a different world, you can treat or help change their underlying thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and physiology. And so it's kind of like a framework for a novel type of social intervention. And we're trying to translate peer support into a standardized, accessible, and quantifiable intervention. I'll talk about the quantification part in a second, because there's a lot of research that you can do when people are interacting in VR. Their voice data, their motion, where they're looking, how they're interacting in the environment, all that data can be captured and used to understand the etiology and also track treatment outcome and also process variables to try to improve it. And so I started doing this with patients where I was just bringing them in VR chat and doing CBT with them. And interestingly, one person said they caught their attention like Disneyland. So they were able to, they said it was really fun, like kind of leaving the rehab center where you're in 8 hours of therapy a day, kind of going to some other place. And we actually went to a bar before leaving rehab, and she was able to, even though it was a virtual beer and a virtual avatar, she was able to go up complete strangers and meet. She knew that in VR chat that they were complete strangers. They didn't know she was a rehab patient. And someone pulled out a beer and offered it to her at the virtual bar. And she said, "Oh, can I have a water?" And they said, "Oh, sure, okay." And they gave her water. So even though she wasn't actually getting a real beer, it didn't matter, because what the anxiety often is that they'll be judged, someone will be judged negatively by the bartender if they ask for water instead of a beer. And so with all fictitious stimuli, she was still able to get that real social interaction and violate that expectation. Another person said that she felt more comfortable opening up and that the visuals of the model stuck with them. So I draw the model in 3D and it's kind of floating there in space. And then we write out their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and you'll see a video in a second of that. But basically, that sticks with patients more. We're seeing after 1 or 2 sessions of this type of therapy that patients are able to visualize the model and actually reframe their automatic thoughts when they experience negative mood. When normally with in-person therapy, that might take 6 or 8 sessions. This is all anecdotal though, so we can't draw any conclusions about it, but it's just observations that we're seeing and trying to take those and create an intervention and then test it to see. Another patient called it an authentic version of benzodiazepines. So she was having panic attacks, she was able to leave, and we went in and we just explored an art gallery for about an hour. And and she basically came out, and you could tell sweat was dripping from her controllers when I handed them to her. I handed the controllers to her originally, and then afterwards she was just completely calm and centered. It was really a transformation in her mood. And then lastly, another person said, and it helps them get out of their own head and concentrate better in person. So people are actually able to, I thought I would have predicted actually that the stimuli and everything in the world would actually be more distracting, but because they're not experiencing that negative mood, it seems like people are able to concentrate better, and they're not face to face. We're in a separate room, so they know they're alone in their room, and so if they talk about childhood sexual abuse or trauma and things like that, they're wearing a mask, they're a little bit protected, and then we're able to really dive into the issues, and it kind of lowers the defenses that someone might have normally in talking about these things. So I also want to talk about the quantification element, because I think it's a really powerful part. I know that there's also, I know a lot of you guys aren't necessarily in clinical, there's like cognitive psychology and other backgrounds, but I think this can be applied in a lot of different areas. And so one is making sense of 3D coordinates. So as people have those 2 hand controllers and are moving, you can actually infer where the rest of their body is and kind of understand what that means. Another thing is location data. So if we were all in a room at a party, you can actually have an XYZ coordinate of where each person is in the room and see those affiliative tendencies and see how those correlate with different variables. You can track people's gaze. So we did an experiment with social anxiety. We had agents, which are automated avatars. Avatar generally refers to when it's controlled by a real person. An agent is a computerized avatar. And you can see where they're looking in the room and things like that. Like by drawing, you don't have eye tracking, but you have a proxy for eye tracking, which is attentional gaze. So if I'm looking over here, you can infer I'm not looking at the stimuli over here. You also have hand movement. So how much are people moving their hands? Are they fidgeting a lot? Are they anxious? Things like that. And head movement is really, just was one example. There's a study where they measured social anxiety with agents, so automated avatars, and you had to sit at a table, and kind of give a talk to them and talk to them. And they made this paradigm because you had to move your head around while you talked to the different people at the table. And they tracked variance in head movement. And so you can see on the left is our socially anxious individuals, and then on the right are healthy controls. And you can see that the people with social phobia move their heads quite a bit more, possibly intending to threat. And so that kind of was a way that you can kind of reliably distinguish between someone who has social phobia and someone who doesn't, just based on the head movements. Another example is voice analysis. So there's been some interesting work where they delivered different types of drugs to people in a controlled study. They had MDMA, meth, and a placebo, and 2 different levels of MDMA. And all they asked them was say, talk to someone close about you. That was just an open-ended question for about 5 minutes. They plotted the relationships and then tried to understand the constructs people were talking about, and in some cases could reliably predict changes. And the same group is now asking people to talk about substances, and they've been able to predict relapse rates by how the person talks about the substance. If people in recovery talk about the substance and how they refer to it and things like that. So a lot of powerful data, and the key thing there is that you're able to get this data naturally. And it's instead of someone they know that when they're in the app, they can know that they're being recorded, but it's very different than having a microphone up to someone. Like, you're kind of in this situation, you're asking people questions, they know that they're in a survey and that their data is being collected, but it's a little bit like they talk more naturally and things like that. So there's some more powerful, it might be more ecologically valid, although you have to compare it to real life as well to really be able to tell the difference there. And so basically after all this, I got this NSF award, which is basically only for travel over a year, and I had to do it's basically to teach academics how to potentially translate their research out into the real world. I think there is also a similar grant in Canada that someone had mentioned to me, but I forget what it was called, but it's basically like helping commercialization efforts, and the government's incentive is so that they can tax the product that's eventually created and make their revenue back. And so I traveled all over the country, and I had to bring, back then, like the headsets I'll show tomorrow basically are wireless and everything. Back then I had to connect the headsets to the computers and everything, so it was just a lot of stuff to lug around, and I went on around for 45 days and stuff. But we eventually, it was basically to see, like, are people interested in this? And a key thing, especially in the US where we don't have a universal healthcare system, to disseminate an intervention, you have to create some kind of business model to scale it, essentially. Otherwise, people won't adopt it. And that's something that we kind of learned during this process. And so that's how I started this company. And I'm just going to show you guys a brief video. BBC came to record what we were doing, and they were able to capture the differences, or capture the intervention. So I just wanted to show you guys that real quickly, and we're just going to skip to
This week, a crisis sweeping America, a public health emergency. Can technology help prevent drug overdoses and fight the opioid epidemic?
Request for an ambulance in Manchester. At the Shell gas station, the patient is in the bathroom. He is overdosed. 5-year-old baby is not breathing, overdose.
America is facing the worst public health crisis in its history.
It's a horseman of the apocalypse, and it's the one named death.
70,000 of its citizens are dying each year from drug overdoses.
I'm not doing nothing except sticking a needle in my arm every day, all day long. It's a waste of everything.
Around 3/4 of those are a result of opioid addiction. It's the #1 killer of Americans under 50, and it has reduced the average life expectancy.
We go out on these types of calls over and over and over again, all day long.
By the end of this program, 3 lives will have been lost due to opioid overdoses. It's a crisis widely blamed on the overprescribing of pain medication, the addictive nature of which has left many turning to the street when their prescription dries up.
I was 16 years old and got my wisdom teeth out, and they prescribed Vicodin. And I was like, what is this miracle? These things are amazing. And in the end, I ended up being an everyday user.
The theory that people open up more to technology is being tested on the outskirts of Nashville, where a new form of therapy is being developed to make it more effective and accessible.
I don't know.
Noah Robinson is using virtual reality to better connect with his patients.
Get up here. All right. You hear me?
By meeting in a virtual world as digital avatars, Noah's found his patients are more receptive.
Yeah, what are the feelings? The feelings are a little bit of anger, I guess. There's some sadness. I just feel crazy.
Witt's abusive relationship with drugs started at a young age, progressively getting worse, up to using opioids. One of the features of VR helping him make sense of his problems is the ability to draw them out virtually so he can better visualize and remember them.
Like, what do you think is the most likely explanation here? This is completely untrue. And most likely all of these are going to be the ones that are the reasons why. I'm always amazed when I get here and step back and look at it all, how ludicrous it sounds in my head. And just to see it lay out, it just all makes sense. No, it's just wild, you know? It's wild. It like, immediately takes you into, I don't know, it just takes you in a different world. Like, when I put that mask on, I'm immediately calmed down because I'm in a world that's so distracting. It takes me out of like the thought I've been obsessing about for an hour and a half. It takes the thought out of my head that's a real belief system at that time, puts it on the board, and I can kind of look at it.
This is just the beginning of trials. So far, it's a single effort, and Noah is yet to scientifically determine the effectiveness of his methods. But these initial sessions have proved promising.
It was actually much more therapeutic for me in virtual reality than I've been actually over here.
Eventually, Noah would like to roll this out so people in recovery could receive virtual therapy remotely. The men here are only visitors. After a month of rehab, they're released back into the world. Having something like this that they could access from home could possibly help them stay sober.
Yeah, so I have some of the experiences with patients and stuff, and it's very hard to describe that. So, but they recorded the screen and the patients, so you can kind of see like the back and forth and stuff. But we're seeing that basically when, because this thing was all written out, like their thoughts, feelings, behaviors, they're able to take a step back and see their situation and their experiencing that affective regulation. So it seems like a really powerful way for them to get that intervention potentially. And so that led us to start this company, Very Well Health. And the basic idea is that within the U.S. at least, and I guess accessibility, as I've learned a little bit more about the Indian healthcare system, because it always seems greener on the other side, and then you learn about like wait lists and things like that here. But the idea in the U.S. still, like availability, there are long wait lists, it's not as accessible, and there's the high treatment cost. And basically, there's the cycle of addiction generally is negative affect, craving, drug use, withdrawal. It's kind of stuck in this cycle. And what we think we can do is potentially, if they put on the headset, like I mentioned before, during the parts of craving, it's an alternative. They can get relief instead of using the drugs. And so we're partnering with the different clinical elements in the United States to try to kind of deploy this and test it as well. And I think in terms of future research, we need to do a randomized controlled trial to actually test whether or not this is working and things. We think that VR can increase the average number of days sober and boost positive affect and kind of facilitate that CB, the skills of therapy. And we also want to focus on medication-assisted therapy and treatment because that's kind of one of the first interventions that's being used for opioid use disorder, as we have this as a psychosocial adjunct to medication-assisted treatment and basically see whether or not it can help improve outcomes. And then also, you know, looking at the duration of a wait list and kind of seeing how we can help people who maybe go on a wait list for treatment and use this as a temporary intervention. Lastly, limitations and risks. So this is a single-arm trial, so we can't really draw conclusions. We don't know what the effects necessarily are. Could people become dependent on VR? We're going to replace one addiction with a process addiction, and what are the implications of that? This is just novelty. Like this is only data from their first VR exposure. So will people become desensitized and not using this much? Some anecdotal evidence that suggests against that, I think, is VR chat and how people are using them for 2 hours a day sometimes, and they're experiencing really powerful social connection, which is kind of the transdiagnostic factor across different elements of psychopathology that can help. And the last risk I'm really concerned about is overdose risk. So we know that when someone uses opioids, if they're in a new environment, they are at increased likelihood of overdose. And so what happens if someone's at home and they relapse and then they put on a VR headset and they're in a new environment? Could that also cause an overdose? And if they didn't have the VR at home, they would have survived or at least gone longer, able to find them and deliver an intervention. So lastly, affordable VR, I think, means that we can create more accessible mental health. The cost has come down tremendously. People can use it at home. And one thing that I'm really passionate about, because I go to some conferences about like industry conferences, and people talk about digital therapeutics, which I really hate that term because it suggests that we're going to need doctors. And there are people who are now getting FDA regulation, which is important to have evidence, but then they're getting doctors to prescribe an app. So literally, you could download the app at home, but no, you need to go into a doctor, which, and get them to write a prescription so that you can download an app. And it's just artificial barriers involved. And always the argument is like, oh, well, there's 325,000 apps out there. We need to get FDA approval and have a doctor prescribe it because that way we can differentiate it. We can get evidence without building walls around apps. So that's just a really big pet peeve of mine. And I think, technology can help us circumvent certain barriers to mental health. And you can also make it standardized. So not just accessible and therapeutic, but you can do a software update and standardize the method of intervention. Or you can also do A/B testing to do micro randomized trials where you actually disseminate an intervention to half the group with consent and everything and see what's working better. So it allows for a lot more dynamic scientific integration to interventions. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge Steve Holland, my PI, who's really helpful. I almost got kicked out of grad school, which is what Paul kind of referred to because my other PIs were very cynical about VR, and Steve kind of he's like to say he adopted me as an orphan. So yeah, that was good. And then Walter Greenleaf is a VR researcher who's helping to has mentored me, and then Brian Moon from Journey Cure, the rehab center, and then also the 10 research assistants who did most of the work of actually running the 241 patients in VR. But yeah, if you guys have any questions or anything, I'm happy to answer.
Got plenty of time for questions. Yeah.
I work as a psychotherapist and a music therapist, and whenever I hear the idea of using something that's digitalized or virtual reality, my first reaction was always around the therapeutic relationship, which is such a huge piece of the work. Yet it seems like there really is, and maybe clarify for me, that there is still a therapeutic relationship that's being built because you're sharing that virtual space. Was that your experience?
Yeah, they seem to really bond with me when we're in the virtual environment, and it kind of allows for a lot of other, especially some of the tougher patients, a lot of men who are really closed and shut down and don't express their emotion. I had a guy who was his wife was diagnosed with terminal cancer, she's stage 4, and he had not talked to his in-person therapist about the fact that she was going to die when he got out, which is going to be a huge risk of relapse. But we were in a world and he was using a mallet to hit the virtual flowers and making music notes, and he was sitting there hitting the flower, and he was like, yeah, I know my wife's going to die. And for the first time he disclosed that, and I think it's because he was kind of distracted, it's kind of like he was distracted, he was in this other world, he was selling an avatar, so he was able to do that. But then that really, I think, created, when he took off the headset and we met in person, he still knew that he had told me that and everything. So maybe not for everyone though, we know that treatment differences exist and stuff, so some people maybe feel kind of distant and stuff like that, but
Seems great.
Yeah.
You talked about wearing a mask, especially when you showed the video of the chat group.
Yeah.
So can people carry over when they take off the mask in the real world? Can they have the benefits? Because there's a lot of security in having a mask and having that kind of virtual environment. So can people carry over the benefits from that mask condition?
Yeah, I think it might be individual differences, so some people might retreat into that and not be able to translate that out into the real world. But what we are seeing, especially from VR chat, and this is, again, Angela, there's a lot of research that needs to be done to prove these things, but VR chat, people are talking about their social anxiety, that when they socialize in VR chat and have social anxiety, or generally, avoidance of being vulnerable, is often due to fear of how other people are going to respond and kind of worrying about that. But when you have that validation and acceptance of the virtual environment, because it's immersive and you feel like you're there, it seems like that changes the self in the virtual environment, which then allows people outside of it to actually still feel that change and carry it over and be able to feel more confident in the real world. But there's also some people who have 8,000 hours logged into VR chat. So, I think there might be some people who are escaping, and that's a big question of how can we ensure that people aren't just escaping in the mass and it's becoming a safety behavior, but instead it's a tool to help them, in the real world and things like that. Yeah.
Have you ever tried these therapy strategies with individuals who have addictions to non-substance type things, like non-VR video games or porn or sex or anything like that?
We haven't, and I think it's a really interesting question of whether a video game or a virtual environment can be used to treat a video game addiction, or is it just going to be, their new addiction? But yeah, we haven't. But I think oftentimes, if you think about the model, like, in this case, it's instead of physiology, that's the addictive behavior, or the addictive process is the behavior is the kind of addictive process. But oftentimes, I think people who do have a dependency or a process addiction with a video game or pornography often have other issues that they're using that to cope with. And so I think if you can treat those other issues in a virtual environment, and again, we have those, we have seen actually I did a poll of VR headset owners, and out of 300 people, 50% had clinical levels of depression or social anxiety. So it's like there's a high comorbidity rate with those dependencies. So maybe we can kind of meet people where they're at, and they're willing to download an app and be an avatar because they play WoW or World of Warcraft or other kinds of things. So yeah, I hope so, but I'm not sure exactly if that can work. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about your limitations and worries about the overdose. Are you suggesting that you're worried that people in VR might take drugs and then go into a new environment and overdose?
Yeah.
Okay, they won't overdose on the VR.
No, but I mean, essentially, the novel environment. Trust me, people have tried VR chat. I think they're 8 hours in VR, and they're so. But no, I mean, yeah, the idea being that a novel environment, it can increase your risk of overdose, and so. And I'm not actually sure exactly of the mechanisms of that, so I need to do more reading about that to understand what the potential risks are. But yeah, if someone relapses, or also, like you mentioned, someone could be incentivized, like, oh, wouldn't this be cool if I was high in this, or and so maybe it can incentivize people to potentially use drugs instead of helping them avoid it. So, yeah. Yes.
Do you know if VR has been used with people with dementia?
Yes, it has a little bit, and especially people with late stage dementia who are nonverbal and things like that. There's been a couple anecdotes, and I don't know of any randomized control trials, but anecdotes of people who go into VR and they bring them back to a place. Like you can use Google Street View to bring someone back, and they smile and they light up, and they sometimes start singing something that they remember or talking, and it's just like they're put in this other state, and it's very, yeah, so I think there's some interesting potentials there.
I think that's huge. Really, the amount of distress that people are in, if they could be brought to a place of less distress, that's huge.
Yeah, and it kind of begs the question about ethics of, if someone's in dementia and they're not necessarily aware of their surroundings, would it be more ethical for them to potentially live or spend a large amount of their time in their past if they're more lucid and kind of experiencing more positive emotion? I don't know, but I think will be another interesting ethical question people in VR try to ask me. They get a lot of social support in VR, and so they say, if I'm going to work in real life, but I'm coming home and most of my social support is in VR, is that a disorder? And so it's a really interesting question, and we've talked a little bit about this, but it's like they're getting social support and they feel, so it's a question of how we define disorder and what our ethical boundaries are in terms of how we integrate technology and stuff. So. Yeah.
So I'm glad you mentioned novelty in your limitations. So have you considered an additional control group in clinical trial where you just do something very fun and novel with them and see if there's actually something special about VR, or like if you take them to paintball or amusement park, it'll kind of have the same.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think that, so Steve, my mentor, is a big fan of basically comparing the intervention to its absence first, just to see, but we could have an additional group there that we do something novel but interesting. And yeah, a lot of people ask about video games too, just like 2D video games or watching a movie. Another sham condition of VR is thought to be no head tracking when you put on the headset. But the issue is, what if part of the effect that we're seeing is the novelty and is the element that the control group might have? Will we reduce our effect size if we compare it to something that also contains part of the treatment intervention? So that's kind of, our first step is to compare it to treatment as usual, just kind of see, but I think that's a great idea of other novel activity. I think that would help address the issue of the sham condition, which I think is hard to do, but you know, amusement park or something could be a really good alternative because it's just out, you know, something kind of very different. Paintball might be painful for people, but I've never done paintball, but yeah. Yeah.
So in your results of the judgments of how long they thought the event lasted, you found that there's a huge proportion that said that they weren't sure. So I was at a timing conference a week ago, and I was actually kind of surprised to see how many people were talking about clinical conditions where people are poor at making temporal judgments. So I just wonder if there's something about, you know, addiction that makes people not as good at putting themselves in the past or putting themselves in the future potentially, and poor at temporal judgments. But
yeah, I'm actually not sure about the self-monitoring. I know that generally there's deficits in self-monitoring and mood tracking, but I'm not sure if that's because of the comorbidity of other like depression, anxiety, or personality disorders, or if that's a result of addiction. And some people actually have permanent brain damage. I mean, we have maybe like 5 or 10% of patients who have just permanent brain damage basically from using, especially meth and other kinds of things that could be an impairment. But was that like other psychopathologies like anxiety and things like that? Or?
Yeah, I think it was depression mostly that I remember, but where they are poor at discriminating like temporal.
Yeah,
like,
but
even
yeah.
like small judgments. So yeah.
Yeah, well that's why I think ecological momentary assessment with like smartphones and things like that becomes a really big tool with that, because you can have people just reporting it over time and you can kind of help them see. And that's with depression, I think, is where people are predicting that they won't enjoy something, even though in the past they did enjoy it and they just didn't realize it or something. So yeah. Yeah.
I think this is also a question about time, but the idea is that when they're in the VR, there's a change of state happening, and then over time, I'm curious about the mechanism by which their anxiety is decreasing. So do you believe that they're later on just remembering the experience of being in the VR? So if the goal eventually is to kind of treat addiction over a long period of time, and eventually someone says, I don't need VR anymore, I don't even feel like I need beer. Is the mechanism there that they're remembering the state they were in, or is there something special about whatever state they're in that's changing their addiction?
Yeah, I think my hypothesis would be that that the virtual reality as the mechanism of intervention moderates the relationship between therapy and outcome of an acquisition of skills, because their experience in VR, they have a regulated mood, but it's also a very different experience that they remember that sticks out in their memory a little bit differently. And so it seems like the combination of the self-regulation when they're in VR, so they can pay attention more and kind of look at themselves from afar, and the memory experience, because I ask people all the time, even someone who tried VR once a year ago, what environment were you in? Can you visualize that environment? And almost always they can. And so it really sticks out in their memory, but that also means if VR becomes really popular and everybody starts doing it every day, is that just going to really, you think about the first movie with a train coming out the audience and they like ran out screaming or whatever, I don't know what's going to imagine doing that, but is the same thing going to happen with VR and all the effects decrease as people adopt it? I'm not sure, but I think the regulated state though, and also not being in front of another person and talking about your most vulnerable things when you're not face to face and you have that kind of defense or safety there, that can also be a potential motive. Yeah.
Do you think there's any potential relationship with this and the success stories you hear about using psychedelics to treat addiction? In
Yes.
the sense that there's this detachment from reality going on?
Yeah, so it's a perceptual shift that's happening with psychotropics and MDMA, things like that, and helping to create a sense of insight. What's interesting is that the VR isn't introducing any external pharmacological agent. So could this, and I mean this is just speculation, but like what is the difference there if you're inducing self-regulation naturally versus introducing external agent? What are the differences there? But yeah, I think some of the literature on shifting perspective using psychotropic drugs could help us to understand the mechanisms that are at play in virtual reality.
Shouldn't you then take the psychotropic while you're on?
Well, yep, actually, yeah, taking the psychotropic while in VR is something I'm very, very interested in exploring. I've never done that. But no, I think it'd be, as a mechanism, I think that they could be synergistic potentially. because you're shifting, and also because you're shifting perspective, but then you have complete control of the person, or the stimuli that the person sees. So you get a completely blank environment or introduce things, and so you could probably have guided experiences that are, you know, that could be really impactful and standardized and things like that. But in the U.S., is that are there any trials happening in Canada with that? Still doesn't, and so because I know in the U.S. it's pretty. I think there's only a few sites that are doing it at this point. But yeah, I think it's an interesting area to explore for sure. Yeah.
So a lot of the therapy stuff you're showing was like mundane things you could do almost face to face with drawing and that kind of stuff with slight kind of VR twists that make it more effective. But what do you think about the potential VR do things that are impossible for a person to actually do? Like play forward in a scenario where they, you know, take the drugs or kill someone or something like that. You could like demonstrate it doesn't work or something like that. So it's totally impossible in real life, but you can achieve it in VR.
Yeah, I think those experiences are really powerful, and what they showed there, the only world that I could draw in VR chat is that bland presentation room. But like you mentioned, I always bring patients on a little adventure through a few world hop, basically, to these completely different looking, like underwater or on the moon and things like that before we go to the bland room, because that way they are really disassociating from reality and kind of they're leaving the rehab center, going into these worlds that are completely different from anything they've ever seen. And I think the more we can do that, the better. I think a big challenge is the programming involved of like specific scenarios and individualizing scenarios for patients takes a lot of programming and time. So I think one question, and I think that's why this area of research is so wide open for lots of different people to get involved in that. How can we individualize environments with a low resource cost and things like that? We brought some patients we use Google Street View at first, and I brought patients, and you see the globe and you can zoom in and go to your address, but everybody goes to their home address first. And one patient was really excited because it was where he was about to leave and go live there again. He was like, I'm sober, I'm looking at my house, it's amazing, and I'm empowered. Another patient went home where she experienced a huge amount of abuse and was triggered and really upset about it after she was standing outside her home and looking at it. So there's also unintended consequences depending on, but I think the abstract environments and doing things that are outside of reality could help to open people up a little bit more and stuff. So.
Well, it's about 3:30. So anyway, thank you very much, Noah.
Thanks.
Yeah, we've got a wine and cheese coming up right now. We're in 2:05, I believe.
And then tomorrow I'll have my headset, so if they want to try, I'm going to try to hook it up so that everyone can see that one person sees. So. Yeah.